I got into all of this to kind of sort out my own stuff in my own head. I spent 6 years in the Royal Marines first, which I'm going to talk about a little bit in a second. And then I kind of switched sides at half time and then spent 6 years in the RAF as a physical training instructor. The Marines fortituded my resolve and my ability to withstand some really tough situations. And the RAF developed my intellect. And from those two experiences, what I've gone on since then is start my own business, and I do coaching and human performance. I'm really fortunate in what I do now. Some of my athletes have won 9 Olympic gold medals between them. I work with world champions, Olympic champions, and I've spent most of my life with a huge amount of imposter syndrome. So if anyone out there feels as though they are ever in a situation where you don't belong, I've been making a whole lifetime of that and still eking my way through. So take comfort in that. So my journey started, like all great journeys, in the fish yards of Peel, around about 13 years old. I'm not even sure with today's laws you could even get children to work in there, but in the 90s, if you were a young lad in Peel or young girl even, and you wanted to make some serious money, you went down the fish yards and you could pull in £200 a week at 12, 13 years old. It's incredible. And I think about it now and it's just insane. And in a weird way, and I was never going to know this, but the guy that stood next to me in the fish yards of Peel, 25 years later, would end up being my business partner. We didn't speak for 20 years. I'm a huge believer in that every position that we're in today. So the position I'm in now on the stage, and everyone that's sat here, you're the culmination of every single decision that you've made, which has brought you to this seat now. And certainly, I never for 1 second when I was at school thought that I was going to end up working with the people that I've worked with in the last 5 or 6 years. Sometimes I have to ask myself how I've ended up here. I've got no formal education of such. I've got no degrees, no masters, no bachelors, so definitely not a PhD. I'm pretty much selling myself at the minute, aren't I? I haven't written any books, unlike most of the other guys that are going to speak on this stage today. And somehow I found myself in a position where I've got a successful business and I get to work with some of the most successful people that I've ever met. It's an incredible position. Now, if I think about where this started, I always think back to when I joined the Marines. When I went to join the Marines at the age of 19, I had a moment of good fortune, and who knows how good fortune comes about? Is it chance? Is it fate, if that ever exists? But I was getting into a lot of trouble in Peel. If you don't have much to do with kids, I think everyone knows this intuitively, they'll find stuff to do that perhaps isn't the most constructive. And I was getting into lots of trouble around about the age of 19. And I was really fortunate that I was arrested by a policeman. But I was arrested by a policeman at a time where he gave me an option. And I'll never forget it. In a police station, he said, you can carry on being I won't repeat what he said because there were children in the room, or you can, with the word that begins with F, leave the island and go and do something with yourself. And I was left with this binary choice, and I chose to leave the island and I went off to the Marines. Now, I never had a passport at this point. I'd never been traveling. The only time I'd ever been away was with Western Athletics Club to go to sail running. I'd had one holiday my whole childhood, which was to Pontins. I still have every memory of it, even though I was around about 8 years old. When I went to the Marines, I was completely oblivious to the world. And I think that's what started off my imposter syndrome, because the first day at Lympstone, which is a very intimidating place, I got off the train and immediately felt as though that I didn't belong there. I looked at the other guys and they seemed more confident than me. They seemed different to me. They spoke different. When you arrive at Lympstone, it's an incredibly... Anyone that knows anything about soldiering, about the Marine training, Lympstone has 2 entrances into the camp. You have one at the top and you have one at the bottom. Now, the one at the bottom, you arrive by train. On the left-hand side of the train, you have the high fence and the bottom field where the recruits are taken to exercise. On the right, you've got the estuary, which is a Exmouth estuary, which when the tide goes out, it just comes complete silt and mud, where the recruits are taken to exercise again. Now, when I got off the train, this is a true story, I remember very vividly that I turned round and 3 guys that were meant to get off just stayed on the train and carried on down to Exmouth. I didn't know that was an option. If I had, I might have stayed with these guys. They seemed to make a smarter option, because before my foot had touched the floor, I was already getting shouted at. I was under this false pretense at 19 years old that I could talk, I could walk, and I could iron my pants. It transpired when I got to the Marines, I could do none of those 3 things correctly, and it would take me 30 weeks to learn how to do them. So I had this kind of huge imposter syndrome, and what I used to think to myself was, if I just got, a few weeks into training, I'd start to feel a little bit like I belonged. But the only problem was, when I got a few weeks into training, I'd start to look at the lads that were a few weeks ahead of me again, and I'd look at these guys and think, well, their berets used to look better, their uniform fitted better, and I just used to have this huge amount of imposter syndrome. But obviously what I couldn't do is I couldn't talk to anyone about this. I just had to deal with it internally, which is inherently part of the problem, I think, of our society today. So then I started to set myself little goals. Well, if I make it to week 10, which is a third of the way through training, perhaps I'll start to feel like I belong then. Got to week 10, still nothing changed. And then I thought, well, week 15, week 20, and we went all the way through training. I started basic training with 67 guys, and 7 of us finished. And as one of those 7, I still didn't feel as though I belonged. Even the day that I got my Green Beret, which is a huge achievement for anyone in soldiering, I remember thinking as the major came down the line after we finished our 30-miler, which is one of the commando tests, once I put this beret on, it's going to be something like out of a cartoon, where I'm just going to put it on and there's going to be some sparks that fly out, and then suddenly I'll grow a few inches and I'll feel like I'm a Marine. But the only problem was, I put the beret on and I didn't feel any different. I still felt as though I was this lad from a fish yard in Peel that didn't belong in the Royal Marines. Now, some things that many people don't know about the Marines: when you leave training, you think that that's it, you've finished and now you're going to be treated better. That's not how it works. When you leave training, you start getting treated worse. For the first 6 weeks I spent at my commando unit, I wasn't allowed to sleep inside my room. It was kind of like an initiation ceremony we used to have. I started off in Arbroath, which is right up near Aberdeen in Scotland, in October. For 6 weeks, I slept under a bush with a poncho over me in my sleeping bag. Obviously, this wasn't doing my imposter syndrome very much good, because I had a huge amount of time to reflect on this situation every night. And I'd look inside each morning. I'd go into the accommodation, I'd iron my uniform, I'd have a shower, I'd have a shave, I'd put on my uniform, we'd go down to company lines, I'd do a day's work, and then I'd go back, and then I'd think, is this the night I get to sleep in my bed? I had my own Man United duvet. I had one of those, do you remember, for those of us that are a little bit older, those TV and videos in one that you could carry around? So it was like a one-piece, it was like a technological piece of genius. I remember I used to be able to look in my window and see my TV and video and my Manchester United duvet. And each night I think, could this be the night? And I'd look at one of the old guys who would be a Falklands veteran, and they'd just go. And I knew that was a signal that it was another night under the stars. So something happened after about 6 weeks of being there. I got sent to America. Which you would think would be a good thing, by the way, but it wasn't a tremendous thing, because I was actually being sent to America to train American Marines. Now, the problem with this was that I didn't really know what I was doing myself. I was filled with imposter syndrome, and then I was asked to go in with another 6 or 7 guys, go to America and train what's called Fast Marines. Fast Marines were Fleet Anti-Terrorism Security Troop. These are the guys that if an embassy gets taken by a hostile force, by terrorists, you retake the embassy. So effectively, it's doing all the stuff that you see on TV. It's helicoptering above a building, and then you fast rope out of the building. So out of the helicopter, fast roping is where you throw believe it or not, this is true. You throw a rope out the back of the helicopter, and with no safety equipment, you put a pair of leather gloves on and you slide down the rope until you get to the building. It seems like it looks great fun on TV, but when you actually do it, it's terrifying. What I've learned with soldiering is most of the stuff that looks really great on TV is not so great when you actually do it. So I was doing this, teaching these Americans. I didn't really know what I was doing, and no one was really talking to me, because one of the things when you join the Marines, you have to earn your place. It's a process where you spend a lot of time early on proving that you're a good lad and you're a solid lad. So that process can take a little while. So I wasn't really part of any team. So my imposter syndrome was on fire at this point, but a little bit of good luck would happen. One of the guys that I was there with lost his wallet. Now, this was the year 2000, so it was pre-9/11. You couldn't do electronic transfers for banks. Without his wallet, he had no way of making money, no way of taking any money out of the bank. So I effectively became the bank for this guy, Nick, who would later become a good friend. Now, I know I'm never going to get this money back, but I'm absolutely happy with this. And I know that I'm buying friendship as well, but I'm absolutely happy with that decision. So I start lending Nick money, and we go out, and suddenly I've got a friend, which I'm happy about. And then one day, Nick comes along and he says, we had one day off while we were in America. We were there for 31 days. And we went out drinking 30 nights out of 31. And then 7 o'clock each morning, we were all dressed in black with a respirator on, waiting to get on a helicopter, burping tequila into our respirators. Suddenly the shiny Hollywood gets evaporated when you look at it from that angle, doesn't it? So we have one night where we don't go out, and this is an R&R day. And what the guys have decided is what we're going to do is we're going to go down and experience something called a Indian sweat tent. So it's part of the Native American culture. They have these tents where they set it up like a sauna, and you go in, and it's about a spiritual experience. Now, we're not going there for the spiritual experience. I'm not going to lie to you. We're going there because it's meant to be a little bit of a man test. Now, I don't know anything about it at this point. I've never heard of it. I'm 19 years old, and I've never been away. But the guys have signed me up to it because Nick needs me to go, because I've got to pay for all of his things all day. So I end up going along to this experience. Now, some things I never forget from that day. The first thing was, I was wearing jeans like what I'm wearing today, jeans and a t-shirt, and it was American. It was really, really hot. The guys were wearing vests, loose vests, and kind of board shorts. And I didn't think at the time that was anything special. Now, once again, we had a hangover as well. And another thing I remember was being in the car, being quite dehydrated, and thinking, I really should get a drink of water because my mouth's a bit dry. I've got a bit of a hangover, so I need to rehydrate, especially if we're going to go and do this experience. So, by the way, has anyone ever been and done something like a German sauna, where you go and you have these incredibly hot saunas? These things are, I'd never been in any experience like this before. I'd never even been in a sauna, in fact, if I remember. So the idea of this really hot tent, it didn't really intimidate me. I didn't think it was going to be too bad. Now, while we're driving down, one of the guys says to me, if you can't stay in the tent, don't worry about it. Many people have to leave. Now, I obviously know what that really means. It means now I cannot leave the tent no matter what happens. And suddenly my internal dialogue starts to, what is this tent going to be like? Is it really going to be this bad? And as we drive down, I'm starting to get a little bit nervous about it. Now, we get down to the Native American Reserve, and I remember thinking to myself, this is an interesting. It was a working reserve. We were kind of going around, experiencing it. I was only a young lad at the time. I'd never left the Isle of Man, so this, or except for to go to running. So this was like a huge experience for me, just going here. And it come to the time where we were going to go into the tent, and I remember thinking to myself, well, how long are we going to be in here? How long does it last? And we were stood outside the tent, and what happened was we went in, and immediately the thing that took my breath away was the heat of the tent. It was incredibly hot. And I immediately started to panic slightly. My internal dialogue was like, this is not normal. You know, I've never been to a hot country at this point. I've spent my whole life in the Isle of Man, and I've walked into a tent which is around about 100 degrees. And my eyes were sweating already, and I immediately remembered that I'd forgotten something. I hadn't drunk any water, and I almost could feel the dryness in my mouth, and I thought, oh, I've made a bit of a mistake here. Now, we sit down inside the tent. There's a pit in the middle where they bring a hot rock in, and they control the temperature with this huge hot rock. It's an incredible experience. Around the outside, there's kind of all seats. It's very like a traditional thing. It's such an incredible thing to see, and everyone sits around in this kind of circle. Now, many people are in there because they're there for the experience, the spiritual experience. Us four noggins from the UK are not there for the spiritual experience. We're there to see who's going to leave the tent first. I also have this realization, by the way, we don't sit next to each other. We sit at adjacent parts of the circle because we want to see into the whites of each other's eyes. I realize the moment I sit down, all the other three guys are staring at me, and I know in that moment they brought me as the sacrificial lamb. I now know why I've been brought on this adventure. And as we're sat in this circle, I'm trying to catch my breath, and I'm trying to compose myself. And anyone that's done anything that's really challenging understands this. You have a battle of your internal dialogue. Part of my internal dialogue is saying, just get out now, just leave. This is, and part of me saying, you cannot leave this tent because you'll never be able to go back to the UK. So we sit in the tent, and then the Native American chief walks in, and I never forget it. It was such an incredible sight. He looked as though he could have been 150 years old. He just had this huge aura and presence. And he walked into the tent, and I just looked up at him, a lad from the fisheries of the Isle of Man that had never been anywhere in the world, was just looking at this chief with full feathers and everything. And he looked at everyone, like he really penetrated everyone's eyes. And as he looked at me, I was like, oh my God, this is incredible. And then he opened the door to the tent and said, bring in the first rock. And I start to worry straight away as they drag in this rock that the only way I can describe it is looks as though it's been boiled in some sort of molten hell from another planet. It's actually exploding as it comes into the room. Now, the minute it comes into the center, the chief lifts his wooden ladle, and there's buckets periodically laid around the tent, and he lifts and he tips the water and goes, hey! And the noise it makes as it explodes is incredible, and the temperature goes immediately up, and I mean, it catches my breath, and I cannot speak, and I'm blinking, and I through my eyes, I see all the three other lads looking at me like this. And I start to panic. My internal dialogue starts to run away. And all the while, the chief is putting more water onto it. And every time water hits this rock, the temperature goes up and up. And I now cannot breathe. And I start to think to myself, what if I die? What will they say in Peel if I die in a tent? What will they talk about down the Marine? They'll be like, do you remember Ray and Leslie's lad that joined the Marines and sweated to death? I can't let my parents go through this. I need to survive, but my internal dialogue is now fighting to stay in this tent. And all the while, more water's been thrown. And in the end, the chief then stops and he asks a question. I want everyone to tell me what you're grateful for. And each person starts to say what they're grateful for. Now, nobody really wants to talk. The English guys that I'm with, or the British guys, they said it one sentence. Grateful for being alive. Grateful for family. But the people that are there for the experience, they really go into detail. I'm grateful for the rivers that feed the oceans, and then the oceans that feed the sky, and then the sky that feeds the trees, and then the tree. And I'm on the other side of the tent going, oh my God, this is not, please don't keep going on with what you're grateful for. And it goes all the way round, and it comes to the guy next to me that I haven't noticed at this point, is wearing a checkered top, all the way down, woolen top, button to the top. And he's there, non-emotional, and I am next to him in bits, almost on my knees, and I look to my right, and he's almost meditating in his tent, and I'm like, how is he doing this? And then he starts reeling off all the things he's grateful for, and it goes on and on and on, and every time he says something, a part of me dies inside next to him. He eventually finishes, it comes to me, I'm like, I'm grateful, I'm just grateful, I'm grateful, okay? And this process goes on for 2 or 3 questions. And it gets to the point where I'm on my hands and knees, and I'm thinking to myself, I can faint. If I faint and I get pulled out, I didn't leave, so I'm still good. So I think to myself about faint, but then I start to worry about my acting ability because it's not great. And if I faint and they see that I'm acting, that's going to be worse than walking out. So I'm now with this huge dilemma. And just to the point where I've got my hand on the floor, and I never forget it, the floor was cold. As I rubbed the soil away, the floor was cold. I was like, how can that be cold? It's like 1,000 degrees in here. I was thinking about digging myself into the hole. There's the cold, follow the cold. And just at the point where I'm about to tap out, and this is the second I'm almost gone, the chief opens the door to the tent. And I survived. Now, what I realized in that experience that day was a couple of things. The first thing, the power of your internal dialogue. What you say to yourself can shape any sort of moment. When you feel terrible, your internal dialogue can really perpetuate that. And certainly in that experience it did. But also what I realized was that in life, you can either be a thermometer or a thermostat. A thermometer reacts one way. So a thermometer reacts to the environment. And that's what I was. A thermostat controls the environment. And in life, it's a bit like that. Sometimes you're reacting to situation. Sometimes you're controlling the situation. And I always think that if you can always focus on trying to be a thermostat, so you control the environment as opposed to the environment controlling you, you at least have an essence of control. So what I want to talk about, which isn't just about a sweat tent, it was kind of just leading me up to it, is my theory on what's happening with us as a species. I'm attempting to write a book, which is torturous, I'm not going to lie, for someone that types with his elbows. But I'm attempting to write a book, and the book I want to write is that the more people that I work with, the more that I'm seeing how stress is affecting us as a species. We've created a world with a very small part of our brain. We've created a world really with our prefrontal cortex, this new brain that's enabled us to think logically, think rationally, have abstract thoughts, think about the future, reflect. But really, a lot of our brain struggles with the world that we've created, specifically our nervous system, which I'm going to talk about today. I have a real belief that I think the evidence and the science backs up that our nervous system has evolved over many, many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, to meet the needs of one thing: survival in the presence of predators. So the ability to be able to identify where we're in danger and move us away from that danger. Now, what we've done is we've tamed nature. We don't have any predators as such anymore, but we do still have the stress response for that same reaction. Now, the only difference is, if a lion... has anyone read the book, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers? Wonderful book, and what it talks about is, if a zebra is chased by a lion, it mobilizes everything it can. It mobilizes all of the neurotransmitters, the hormones, everything it can to escape it. You know, it's going to have adrenaline, it's going to have everything. The blood will be pushed away from its digestive system into its extremities, and it will sprint with every stride it's got. And there's going to be a battle of nature that happens. The zebra hopes to outrun the lion. Now, if the zebra can't do that, it's game over. It doesn't need to worry. But if it does, all the zebra does when it finishes is it shakes itself off and starts eating grass and having a drink of water. Now, What we have with our consciousness is the ability to add meaning to things. If a lion chased me, the chances are I'd probably end up in therapy, because I'd be wondering why the lion chose me. Did it not like my clothes? Did I say something to it that offended it a long while ago? Why was I picked out and no one else? I would add this huge amount of meaning to the situation, which leads me on to the second part that perhaps is a consequence of that thinking brain. We reflect so much. I think one of the wonderful things that Mike teaches in mindfulness is about being present. But most of us spend the entirety of our life in the past reflecting, in the future thinking about what we need to do. If you think about a typical day that you have, most of the day you'll be thinking about where you need to be next and what you need to do next later. What time do you need to pick someone up? What time do you finish? And we spend a huge amount of our time, and I don't think animals do that so much. I think animals are very present. If they're hungry, they eat. If they're thirsty, they look for water. And if a lion chases them, they run as fast as they can. But I think one of the things that it's a handicap. Our gift of consciousness comes with a handicap, and that means we spend a huge amount of time outside of the present moment. I missed Ian's talk in the other room about Wim Hof method and his journey. I too practice the Wim Hof method. I'm a huge advocate of it. And one of the reasons is because around about 2 years ago, I got burnout myself. Now, I work with a lot of organizations, and I say the same thing. Information is not the problem in the world. Implementation is the problem. People know intuitively what they should and shouldn't do, but it's the implementation of that information. I knew all of the science behind burnout. I was teaching it. I was preaching from the front, but I wasn't really living it off the stage. And what happened was, one day I couldn't get out of bed, and I spent 2 weeks just struggling to get myself going. And what I realized was, although I was doing something I loved, I was teaching, you can still burn yourself out doing something you love. Just because you enjoy the process, just because you enjoy the experience, doesn't mean that you don't have a consequence for that. Now, all that had happened is I'd frazzled my nervous system for 2 weeks solid. I'd taught 2 courses back to back at our academy, training for around about 12, 13 hours a day for 14 days straight, loving every minute of it. On the 15th day, that was it. Gone. I couldn't get out of bed. And I realized that my nervous system was designed, the stuff that I was teaching people, I was not living it myself. I wasn't allowing myself to move from the sympathetic nervous system into the parasympathetic. I was in my sympathetic nervous system non-stop. I had cortisol, which is your stress hormone. I was enjoying the experience. It was amazing. But that still came with a consequence, like I've said. Now, some of the things I want to talk about today, I want to try and give you a little bit of science. Now, once again, I'm not an academic, I'm a coach, but I do spend a lot of my time studying and researching. The more that I know about the brain, the more that I know about the nervous system, it enables me to coach much more effectively. We only have one stress response, by the way. All of us have not developed a 2018 2.0 stress response. Our stress response is the same as the way it was evolved. We either fight, flight, or freeze, and all of them sympathetic nervous system. That's all we have to do it. A lot of people say to me, well, what about evolution? Is evolution not giving us a much more comprehensive way to live in this modern world? Well, if you do the maths on evolution, the start of civilization maybe 6,500 years ago, if you say that we average 60 years per life and we give birth every 20 years, there's like 270 generations from your seat up your family line to the start of civilization. 270 births and deaths is not a lot of opportunities for evolution and the Darwinian theory to take hold. It takes hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. So, and that's whether you believe in Lamarck or in Darwin. Now, what we have to understand is we need to start being adaptive to our environment. We need to stop thinking that more is less with work, and we need to find a way to balance ourselves out. One of the wonderful things about the Wim Hof method is the breathing moves you into that parasympathetic state. That when I first started practicing it, just watching YouTube, I found a way suddenly that I could take myself when I'm kind of highly stressed and pumped up, and within 10 or 15 minutes, I could move myself into a position where my nervous system had flipped itself out of parasympathetic into sympathetic. Sorry, the other way around, sympathetic to parasympathetic. Now, the reason this is so valuable is, let me give you one example. Who here has children that are doing exams? Anyone? So a very highly stressful time for children. When you're in your parasympathetic nervous system, you're much more creative. The beta waves in your brain slow down and your alpha waves increase. Your cognition is better, your memory is better. When you're in sympathetic, so when you're in high stress response, your limbic brain takes over a little bit. And now what that does is it takes blood away from your neocortex, your logical brain. So when children are stressed out in an exam, that's why they struggle much more to perform for many, many children. It's not because the intelligence isn't there. It's just because that when they're in a stress response, they're not as intelligent in that state. So breathing exercises and finding a way that they can move themselves into parasympathetic and slow that process down allows them to become more creative. It allows them to become more cognitive. It allows them to increase their memory. So a very simple way of understanding children with stress is, well, let's use things like mindfulness. Let's use things like Wim Hof method, whatever it is, and let's encourage children to be able to control their state. Because surely the whole point of an exam is to test the capacity that the child has in that moment. If they're reduced because of stress, you're not getting a true reflection of the exam, perhaps. So some of the other things that I've been looking at within my research is there are a couple of things that are very different with us as Homo sapiens and every other species of animal on the planet, and we are an animal as well. I think there are two things that we were never really designed to have, and I'll expand on both of those things. Comfort and abundance. The abundance for me is almost the seat of all depression. It's the comparison element that we live in, accentuated today by social media. There's no animal on earth that has an abundance of anything. Every animal on earth has a natural balance with all the other animals around it. So what we have is this kind of huge thirst for more and more. It's the theory of how many shoes do you need to walk and how many cups of coffee and it's more and more and more. And I think what happens now with advertising, this is getting more and more expanded. Now, comfort is another thing that really fascinates me. So I don't know if anyone listened to Ian's talk about the Wim Hof method, but part of the Wim Hof method is deliberately going into cold water. Now, as an ex-Royal Marine, I spent my whole life trying not to go into cold water because it was such an incredibly torturous experience. But actually what I've learned over the last 2 or 3 years of doing it, of practicing it, is that when you start to experience the benefits of using stuff like breath work in cold, even though it's uncomfortable, even though it's not in your comfort zone, what it does is it has an incredibly positive effect on many of our systems, our immune system, endocrine system, our general mood. When I go cold water swimming in December in Douglas Beach with people walking their dogs looking at me like I'm absolutely barking mad, for the rest of the day, I feel a positive effect of that uncomfortable experience of 10 or 15 minutes. So I think that we live in this world where we're bending nature to our comfort. If you think about the way we are as humans, we shape nature to fit a very narrow perimeter of where we're comfortable, and that is good. I'm not advocating that we should walk around freezing cold all day long, but what it does do is I think it does weaken our more ancient defenses, more animalistic defenses. If you look at all the other animals in the animal kingdom, they experience nature in its full element, both good and bad, and that strengthens and binds their nervous systems and their ability to deal with that. we still have that ability. You know, I think what Wim shows is that he has the ability to deal with some incredibly cold experiences that goes against logical thinking. But actually, it's just what we were evolved to experience. So comfort and abundance are not necessarily our friends. Now, one of the other things that I think that is an element into moving back towards simplicity is there's another C that I think is very, very negative in our mindset. I've got this belief, and I don't really have any science to back it up, but a lot of depression actually formulates in comparison. We spend a lot of our time comparing what we have to what other people have got, whether that be physically looking, whether that be materialistically, whether that be jobs. I don't know if anyone's watched any of Professor Sean Akers stuff, but he postulates through positive psychology that only 10% of our happiness is dictated by the things that we have. 90% of our happiness is dictated by the lens in which you perceive reality. So the way you perceive a situation dictates the way you feel about that situation. Now, a wonderful example of this is my wonderful partner, Ruth. She has a serious illness, and it's an incurable condition. When she first had the condition, for a long time, she would say, "Why me? I'm a good person. Why should I have this illness?" But what she ended up doing was saying, well, saying why me isn't helping me. Saying why me is just making me feel worse. And she said, well, why not me? So she just flipped the lens 180 degrees and started saying, why not me? Why should someone else have had this and not me? And the moment she did that, she's still left with the illness, but what she's left with now was that she now starts to own the situation. I can't affect the outcome of it, but I can affect having it. So comparison is this huge problem that I think we're having, and I think it's getting magnified and accentuated for young people by social media. I think social media gives people a skewiff lens of comparing. People, comparing what they're having for their tea. Everyone's tea looks great on Instagram, doesn't it? So all of these things, I think that are contributing to the way we are as a species and the way we're starting to evolve. And I think we're approaching a point where we're going to have to de-evolve slightly to move forwards. I think we're going to have to start working towards adapting a different way of thinking that isn't so much centered around our neocortex. Mindfulness is a good example. A lot of the companies that I work with, I say there are 3 things that you can do really simply that affect the way your mind works. Your brain is like a muscle. It's the same as any other muscle. If you work it and train it, it will develop and grow. We know this from neuroplasticity. We know this from looking at taxi drivers in London. Taxi drivers in London have a hugely developed part of their brain which links to their ability to know where they are and to locate themselves. And that's because they've studied the knowledge. So when you practice things with your brain, it changes the way your brain works. So as an example, when someone first suggested to me about doing things like a gratitude log, I used to think, well, how will that work? Now, I'm a little bit of a scientist. And one of the things that I always have to know is, well, how does that work? So doing a gratitude log sounds like a great idea, but how does it work? So let me explain my understanding of how it works. There's a part of your brain called your RAS. Has anyone heard of that before? The reticular activating system. It's a little bit, I suppose, to use a metaphor, it's like a Google search engine in your brain. The things that you search for, it ends up with a browser history. So the best example I can give is, most of you have had an experience of this when you decide to buy a new car. And you might decide to buy whatever car it is. We were talking about this on a course yesterday. So, for instance, a brand new Audi, for instance. And what happens when you're researching this car to buy and then you decide to buy it, as I'm sure most of you will experience, you start to notice these cars everywhere you go. You start to know, well, has everyone suddenly decided to buy the same make and colour car that I've been looking at? But the reality of it is that those cars are always there, aren't they? They haven't appeared in your reality because of the way you think. But the thing that's changed is you've noticed them. Now, I used to coach at a place called Battleback. It's an incredible place at Lilleshall. It's funded by the British Legion. It's run by Leeds Beckett University for Carnegie Great Outdoors. And the people I used to coach were wounded, injured, and sick servicemen. So I would be a coach for Leeds Beckett, and we'd have PhD psychologists who would monitor and measure the effect of what we were doing with our coaching. Now, one of the models we used to teach them was this model of the RAS. Now, the reason why we used to teach it was because we knew that for some of these soldiers, specifically the ones that had some fairly serious stuff going on, their searches in Google, their own mind, were often very destructive. And what we used to say at the start of the week, we need to change your thinking one thought at a time. So we explained how the RAS worked. The more you think about something, the more it's going to be inside your neural activity. Then your brain starts to notice evidence to support it. So if you put into Google, I hate my life, and it's the worst thing in the world, and for some of the guys at Battleback, they would put in things like, I want to commit suicide. If you put that into Google, that's going to give you some incredibly negative results. Now, if you keep thinking that, and that goes over and over, and it runs around your internal dialogue, and then what happens then, you start to notice evidence to support that your life's no good. And that supports your thinking. You get this evidence-belief exchange. So what we used to say to them is, we want you to focus on 3 things you're grateful for. Just small things. You know, I'm grateful that I've got a house. I'm grateful that I've got the ability to walk, because some of my other guys that I went to war with, they do not have that same ability. They don't have to be huge things. 3 different things every day. And what we know happens, if you keep doing this and practicing it over and over again, your brain starts to retrain itself. You start to look for things to be grateful for. You start to notice things that make you feel grateful. And very, very slowly, we can help them to think a little bit better. It doesn't solve all their problems. I'm not for 1 second saying it solves everything. But what it does is it shows them the science behind, if you do these things over and over again, you can slowly start to retrain your brain. Now, the other thing that I say to people is meditation is wonderful, because what meditation does is it moves you into that slower brainwave parasympathetic state. So whether it's Wim Hof, whether it's mindfulness, whether it's yoga, whatever takes you out of this cultural ADHD that we've got, where we're hyper-stimulated 24 hours a day, whatever gives you that reprieve from that is soup for your soul, for your nervous system. And you only need to do 10 or 15 minutes a day, and that has a huge effect, just slowing things down. When I practice the Wim Hof breathing for 5 or 6 weeks every single morning, I feel better and better as the time goes on. Then I get busy with my work. Then I don't do it for a few weeks. I forget how good it feels. Like all good humans, we're good at not doing the things that are really good for us. The moment I do it again, I feel brilliant again. And I'm like, well, why haven't I been doing this for the last 3 or 4 weeks? So whatever it is that you have, it might be painting, it might be writing, it might be doing poetry, it might be meditation. Every day, do something that just draws you away from this hyper-stimulated world that we live in. Moving towards simplicity in a small amount can have a huge effect on your mindset and your well-being. So I'd like to just finish with a couple of stories which I think highlight it. So I knew a wise man that once spoke of a quarryman. I don't know if anyone's ever heard this before, but it's a really good analogy to understand the way we are as humans. So the quarryman worked inside a quarry every day. He toiled away, hacking away at rocks, and he would shovel the rocks into his wheelbarrow, and he'd take them to the mouth of the quarry. He spent all day, every day, doing this manual labor. And all the while he was doing it, he complained about the hand he'd been dealt. He complained about his blisters on his hand. He complained about the weather above his head. He complained about non-stop. And then one day, a genie appeared next to him, and the genie said to the quarryman, so if I give you wealth and a nice house, you'll be content with the power that you have. And the quarryman said, well, absolutely. So the genie clicked his fingers and the quarryman became a rich man. And he woke up in this huge penthouse apartment and was immediately happy with his life. And then he heard a huge commotion down in the road underneath his apartment. And when he went to the window, he seen crowds lining the streets, soldiers marching down the road. Then the cavalry followed the soldiers. And then finally, the king and queen in a huge golden horse-drawn carriage came down the road. People waving their flags. And immediately, the rich man, the quarryman who became a rich man, was immediately jealous of what he'd seen. And he said, well, why can't I be a king with a kingdom and people to rule over and a castle and palaces? And the genie appeared and said, if I give you a kingdom, if I give you a castle, you'll now be content with all the power that you have. And the quarryman who became a rich man said, absolutely. So the genie clicked his fingers, and the quarryman who became a rich man then became a king in a castle. So then he woke up in his castle. He felt absolutely powerful as can be. He went out onto his balcony, looked out across his whole kingdom as far as the eye could see, and was once again content with what he had. Until the sun came out one day and started to dry up all of his lands. The crops started to fail. All of his disciples started to come to the castle and protest against the king because the weather was too hot and they couldn't grow anything to feed themselves. And suddenly then the king felt powerless and started to complain about the fact that the sun was so much more powerful. At which point the genie appeared and said to the quarryman who became a rich man, who became a king, if I make you the sun, will you then be content? And the king said, of course, what's more powerful than a burning ball of helium and hydrogen 9 million miles away? And he clicked his fingers, and in that moment there, he became the sun. And finally, beating down as a star in the universe, he was happy with his power. And then one day, he was shining his rays down on planet Earth, nourishing the crops, and a cloud went across the front of him and started to rain. And it rained and it rained and rained. And the more that the sun tried to penetrate the cloud, it had no effect whatsoever. So the quarryman who became a rich man, who became a king, who was now the sun, started to feel really powerless against the rain clouds and started to complain about the hand he'd been dealt. In that moment there, the genie appeared and said, so if I make you a rain cloud, you'll now be happy with what you've got. And the sun said, of course, water is the source of all life. If I could give water, then I effectively control everything. Clicked his fingers, and he became a rain cloud. And he started to rain. Rain, rain, rain. And then one day, he sent down this torrent of rain, almost of biblical proportions. And as he sent down this torrent of rain, he created a huge flood. And he's seen this outcrop of rocks, and he thought, do you know what, I'm going to rain so much, I'm going to wash these away. And he rained and rained and rained, beating down on these rocks. But when the sun came out and the water level dropped down, the rocks still stood firm, just as they were at the start. So he rained again, even harder this time, torrents of rain. But once again, once the rain subsided, the rocks remained. And suddenly the quarryman who became a rich man, who became a king, who became the sun, who became a cloud, suddenly felt powerless and said, I wish I was just like a solid rock like that, immovable, all-powerful, strong to everything. And in that moment, the genie clicked his fingers and he became a rock. And finally was happy until one day he noticed the quarryman walk towards him. So, just to finish off, the chief opened the door to the tent and said, bring in the next rock. At this point, I freaked out. I was on my knees and I was literally begging. But there's going to be a change in my fortunes that happened in this moment. And anyone knows this. When you're really struggling in something like a physical activity, so you're running a marathon or you're doing anything that's really, really hard, and you feel terrible, there is only one thing that makes you feel better. And that's when you see someone else that's worse than you. And I looked up And I hadn't noticed at this point, but one of the other guys is not doing well at all. He is on his knees and he's about to crawl out. And the moment I see him, I get some strength inside. My internal dialogue changes. I start to become focused on how much pain this other guy's in rather than my own pain. And that helps me immensely. And suddenly I start to feel a strength that I didn't think that I had inside me. I was literally seconds from leaving, and now I'm almost enjoying this experience in a little bit of a sadistic way. And as I'm doing this, the chief walks round and then he starts to tell a little story. And I'll never forget the story. It's the first story I ever heard, and it's left a lasting impression. And the chief said, each man has two wolves that lives inside of him. And these two wolves are going to fight to overtake the direction of the soul of that person. They want control, but they have to fight each other. One wolf is jealous. One wolf will take instead of give. One wolf is conniving, will work against the good of everyone around to get what they want. The other wolf will always do the right thing, will help other people, will give to other people, will always be generous in any situation. And they fight hard. And in my newfound strength, just as I look up, the chief looks down at me and asks him the question, well, which wolf will win? And the chief said, it's easy, it's the one that you're going to feed the most. And then he walked out of the tent, and I'd never seen him again. So thank you very much. It's been great chatting.